Last year, I bought an old beat-up DSi from eBay for something like 20 bucks. I always wanted to fix some kind of broken console. I wanted to understand the system and how it works, or why it doesn't. $20 for a fun electronics project that might just reward me with a working DSi was just too good to turn down. Plus, I hadn't had a DSi since around 2012. I wanted to see and hear this console's menus again. I wanted to bring this mangled corpse of a system back from the dead, even if it cost me my soul. And I'm telling you, it nearly did. But despite my efforts, I never did bring that DSi back. This console defies me even as we speak, or as I speak, you shouldn't be speaking. After hours and hours of tedious electronic surgery and sorcery, this piece of plastic and metal remains just that, unresponsive, sitting in what may very well be its final resting place. If I could have reanimated this lifeless device, I would have successfully completed a complex multi-part repair on the single most difficult DS system to make such repairs on. A fact that I was oblivious to when purchasing the DSi as my first repair project. But perhaps my loss can become your gain. Stay a while and hear the story of this accursed console. The grim tale of my failed DSi repair. All I knew about the DSi that I was about to order was that it wouldn't charge and the screens were in pretty rough shape. But it wasn't until it arrived that I realized that the screens were in really rough shape. But first things first, I just want it to power on. If there's some heavy cosmetic damage, I can deal with it later. Or never. It didn't really matter to me. But I guess it would look pretty bad if I told someone about the DSi that I fixed and then showed them this. After doing my best to diagnose the system, I came to the conclusion that this was going to require me replacing the charging port as well as the battery. So I purchased the relatively inexpensive parts from Amazon and awaited their arrival. Meanwhile, I watched some tutorials on how to replace the charging port of a broken DSi, and let's just say there aren't any Linus Tech Tips videos on DSi charging ports. But that's fine by me, I enjoy the more rustic style videos anyways. I do not, however, appreciate rustic style charging ports. See, DSi charging ports, not unlike their replacement tutorials, can only be acquired through small third-party retailers. Looking through the Amazon reviews certainly didn't inspire confidence. There seemed to be a level of RNG to these charging ports, like some people got exactly what they were looking for, while others got something completely different. But to my delight, when this package had arrived after its long journey from the land of exported odds and ends, it was indeed a charging port for a DSi, not like a golf ball or something. And with it came the Chinese replacement battery that I ordered. It was at this point that something occurred to me. I could just swap the battery out now and get a glimpse of this system before even repairing the charging port, as long as the battery has some life in it. I hesitated for a moment. Maybe I shouldn't give myself any spoilers, I want to feel like I earned this. Then remembering that a soldering iron would be involved in replacing the charging port, I figured I might as well power it on now before I break it trying to make the repair. Click, click, bam. Oh no, those screens are destroyed. I really believed that those lacerations were just superficial, but no, this thing was murdered. Dr. Kawashima gave the wrong person the wrong brain age. I'm always shocked at how destroyed some systems get. This isn't just your typical DSi frisbee throw, or screen punch, there was a weapon involved in this. Hell hath no fury like a kid that can't beat a Plants vs. Zombies level. This isn't a novice repair, this is something that I am not at all qualified to attempt. I sat in contemplation for a bit, but eventually convinced myself that this wasn't something to back down from. Sure, I hadn't repaired anything successfully, or soldered anything, or opened anything and closed it again without completely killing it, but this is different. I purchased this DSi from eBay and took on the responsibility to bring it back to life. If I hadn't purchased it, some electronics expert might have, and they'd probably get it working in no time. So you know what? Even if I've got to buy some more parts or learn some things, I needed to at least try. I had to restore the link to my handheld gaming origins. I messed it up. Okay, so I decided to start by replacing the charging port so that I could at least power the system on reliably and test the screens later. Now I don't have footage of this attempt, but it went something like this. Start to remove the back of the DSi. Strip a few screws using a bad screwdriver on tiny, tightly set screws. Cut through the actual plastic shell to clear the wedged screw. Reveal circuit board. Be amazed and overwhelmed by the miniature metropolis that sat before me. Inspect charging port. Yep, broken I guess. Listen to this guy who told me to clip it in half with pliers. Port won't rip. Violently tear port in twine, bending the board in the process. Hope that didn't just break it already. Get new charging port. Legs are too tall. Bend them. Whoops, break them. Try to solder charging port to board. I can't do it. And that was the story of my DSi for about a year. But it wasn't useless. I worked it into some videos as a prop item. Something to throw around with complete disregard to whatever technological mysteries lurk inside. But I still felt a little bad. I hadn't even put that much into trying to figure this wonderful little device out. Now it was just an inert brick to throw around for comedic effect. But sometime a few weeks ago, I started to think about these kinds of projects again. And I felt like the best way to get started was to finish my first project. So I sat down at this desk that I apparently dragged out of a medieval catacombs, judging by how much dust and debris is on it. I had a top and bottom LCD, but I needed to order a new charging port. But this time, I'm not just gonna start poking a 600-degree iron around the board with no experience whatsoever. So with the charging port, I ordered a practice board. You're supposed to solder on these components in each of the 500,000 LED lights, and it lights up if you wire it to a battery or something, but I just want some spots to stick stuff to. So I plugged in the iron and got to soldering. Or at least trying to. And it was through this experience that I learned something about soldering. It only takes a few seconds to solder something to a board, but the experience somehow finds a way to last an hour. And boom, 4 barely visible pieces of plastic were now officially part of this blue thing. Now, I was ready. So I prepared the charging port by bending the legs and not breaking them. I laid the piece on the circuit board, then picked it up and spun it around because it was backwards. Then, carefully, the iron approaches the board. 1 second too long, one slip up, and I could burn something out, possibly ruining the whole board. So, cautiously, pin by pin, I formed the connection between this piece of precarious Chinese technology and a perplexing Japanese circuit board. I could have sworn a bolt of lightning rang out in the distance when I soldered the last pin. Despite it having been a rather fair-weathered day, it was much more likely a gunshot or a car accident, but I digress. It was complete. All that was left now was to stitch things up and run some volts. Well, it doesn't really close, the pins were too long. Nonetheless, it was now time to put my work to the test. Had I just performed a surgery that could bring a system back from the dead? With 5 volts in hand and a racing heart, I stared feverishly at what I had just created and let out my best cackle. What if the light doesn't come on? I definitely messed something up. What if I burn the whole board up? Are soldering iron burns carcinogenic? But all of these thoughts came to a screeching halt. I had done it. My work was successful, and just like the great Dr. Frankenstein, I let out a hearty, "Let's go!" The DSi's charging port now works. Intermittently. It stops after about 15 seconds, and you have to plug it back in. But that's better than the 0 seconds it would charge when it didn't have a charging port. I may end up with some kind of finger cancer in 20 years, but I knew that I could at least power on this DSi. Unless the finger cancer got real bad, I guess I should have weighed the pros and cons a bit better. And there I sat, a screen, a broken one, but a screen, staring back at my deranged gaze. It was moments like these that filled me with the courage to carry on with this restoration. Seeing that charging light illuminate, it was like I was turning on the console again for the first time. I thought that if I could repair this system, I might just be able to time travel. Although I'm not sure the DSi could handle that. I think it doesn't have much RAM. It was augmented reality, that's what it was. That was the 3DS, wasn't it? Well, even if I can't time travel, I can at least remember. I can remember what it was like to send a Picto chat, or make my own animation in Flipnote Studios, or check the time. Sure, I could just do all those things on my 3DS, but I feel like the old timer was just better. But I don't see myself picking that despicable device up anytime soon. See, the charging port triumph was motivating, but no amount of motivation would get me through the endless onslaught of ribbon cables, tiny wires, ribbon cables. The successful repair of the charging port was still fresh on my mind the next morning, and with this confidence, I headed after the lower LCD. Now this wasn't going to be anything like the replacement of the charging port, because on one hand, there wouldn't be any soldering, but on the other hand, I would be unplugging a bunch of tiny ribbon cables. If I were to pull one of these a little too hard at the wrong angle, the system could explode. Well, it could break. So one by one, I carefully lifted the teeny tiny plastic switches that locked the ribbon cables in place and gently removed them. Now I only had to unplug and remove the old LCD and replace it with the new one. I almost couldn't believe that it was going to be this easy, but I assumed that it was just my new confidence making this feel so simple. So I pulled out the old beat up lower LCD and prepared the new, much cleaner, much shinier, much slimmer LCD. That's when the tutorial I was following told me to peel the touchscreen digitizer off of the old LCD and put it on the new LCD. To peel the old, scratched up, probably broken touchscreen off of the definitely broken LCD and put it on a new functional LCD. So I went ahead and ordered a new DSi touchscreen and called it a day. I started this journey into an old broken DSi in search of a better understanding of the tiny mysterious world within, but it seemed my search all too often led me to Amazon.com. Each replacement part was another reason to keep going, but by which part would it become a reason to quit? Well, for whatever reason, it wasn't the touchscreen that made me realize that this DSi was a lost cause. So I pushed forward through the tomb of 1,000 ribbon cables. Luckily, I was past most of those cables at this point. All that stood between me and that top screen now were 4 screws located under these pieces of rubber. In this moment, I had a brief flashback to when I was first trying to open up the DSi and how much pain those little screws caused me. But I wasn't too worried. I had come this far, I think I can get past a few screws. That was until I saw the screwdriver I was working with. What ensued was one of the most intensely frustrating parts of this repair. It was like I was trying to use a grain of rice to turn a grain of salt. I pushed down as hard as I could, but the tiny screwdriver kept slipping out of my grip. And as soon as I started to feel the screwdriver twisting, I would hear a click, because I was just twisting the screwdriver and stripping away the screw. If I kept going on like this, something was gonna break, and it might not be an accident. So, I called it quits. Everything went back in the drawer the way it was. Not how it was originally, all together and stuff, but how it was after I dissected it into a million pieces. I felt like I might really be done working on this thing. It was already such a headache, and I hadn't even reached the top screen to attempt a repair. But I eventually snapped out of my blind rage over that stupid screwdriver and realized that this wasn't where I stopped. I've got to at least give it a shot. Plus, I had a touchscreen on the way, so that would really suck if I just quit. But I had to upgrade my arsenal a bit. My gear clearly wasn't strong enough for this section, so I did a bit of searching and a bit of crafting and came back with a crappy little 3D printed plastic pry bar and a screwdriver that I won't accidentally inhale. So, with a slightly different approach, I attacked the screws again. And as if I had hit some sort of gear level threshold, the screws were suddenly just normal screws. They twisted right out. Now it was time to replace the first of the 2 LCD screens. What lay beneath that plastic cover was something terrible, a ghastly revelation it was, and oh how cruel to only show itself now. It seemed the bad news was almost as hard to reach as the good news, and to make things worse, another trial of frustration was in store, one that would boil my blood even quicker than my skirmish with the screws. As the cover slid away, I laid my eyes upon quite a rare sight indeed, the back of a DSi Upper LCD. Even if I wasn't able to finish this repair, it still felt like a victory to be able to see this. But sadly, that optimism was short-lived. When I lifted the LCD from where it lay and prepared the new LCD, the tutorial delivered another blow to my morale. Remove the old lens, it says. Put it on the new LCD, it says. If you're wondering what a lens is in this context, don't worry. I was too. So, here I was again, after all of this, with a bad LCD out and a good LCD that can go in because there's something on Amazon that I have to order. No, not this time. This time, I didn't let that slow me down. This wasn't a touchscreen digitizer, this was just for looks. So guess what? I lifted that old slashed up lens off of the old LCD and put it right onto the brand new LCD. Like I said earlier, I didn't care if it looked good. It would be a miracle if it worked. And oh yeah, remember how I wasn't supposed to have to do any soldering? Well, turns out you have to remove the speakers from the old LCD and resolder them onto the new one. So reluctantly, I dragged all of that stuff back out and got to work. I can see now that my rash and frantic actions were an indicator that my frustration meter was getting pretty high, another mechanic of electronic repairs that I didn't know existed prior to this experience. But what happened next would unfortunately max that meter out. And when the meter maxes out, the DSi goes back in the drawer, which is exactly what happened after some time fiddling with these tiny, fragile little wires and these 2 horrible ribbon cables. The wires need to be pushed down into an incredibly tight position to stay clear of everything else when you close the system back up. Problem is, you can't hardly push them into place without damaging them and making them pop out of place where you just push them down. But what ultimately did it for me was getting the cables back through the hinge. I tried to push these 2 strips through this tiny slot for what felt like an eternity, trying to be gentle enough not to tear them, but also trying to commit enough to get them at the right angle that would allow them to pass through. I really had to keep an eye on exactly what the guy in the tutorial was doing. I felt like some kind of FBI image analyst, trying to figure out exactly how his hands moved to make the cables pass through the plastic. It was like this repair tutorial just turned into a magic trick demonstration. But I wasn't let in on the trick, I was just some guy on the verge of madness trying to cram wires through a slot. It didn't take much of this for my anger to push me to surrender. I give up. I'm done. I wasn't gonna fix it. Until the next day when I got the touchscreen and decided I'd give it another shot. And on the next day, as if by divine intervention, those ribbon cables clipped right through that plastic. I still had some low main to push down into place, but I had the patience for that today. And what felt so intimidating before was now as simple as laying a touchscreen down, which I actually almost messed up, and setting the lower LCD in place. Now it's as simple as plugging everything back up and closing the system. So, not really simple at all, it's super tedious really. If there's anything worse than unplugging ribbon cables, it could only be plugging them back in. You know that thing that happens when you try to push a dollar through the slot in a vending machine and the dollar just bends instead of feeding through? That's what this was, but I was using tweezers to push a tiny dollar through. I did my best to push them in as far as I could without breaking them and sealed everything back up. The lights came off, the candle came out. This is it. This is when I get to find out if I had just performed an electromedical miracle. But as I pressed the power button, all I got was a blink. A little sliver in time where I really had repaired this DSi, where it really would power on. But the split second that it was alive passed just as quickly as those in which it was merely a brick of potential. I tried for about an hour to fix whatever had gone wrong. I secured ribbon cables more tightly than they had been, I checked the upper screen, but nothing. And after a while, it wouldn't even blink. The flicker of the top screen was agitating, to know how close I was, to rely on hope rather than have an answer. But now, I had my answer. The machine sat silent, dark, cold. Which is actually good, you don't want it heating up or anything, but now it would never heat up. Now, it was nothing more than a costly corpse. Perhaps someday I'll muster up the courage and knowledge to take on that ravaged DSi again. Or maybe I won't. And I guess it doesn't really matter, does it? I never really expected to fix the DSi in the first place, I just wanted some understanding. And you know, I'm not intimidated by the idea of opening up a system like that and making repairs anymore. I could definitely see myself doing more projects like this in the future. Not like this one, something more simple, but something nonetheless. In a way, it was actually a great first project, since now I'm comfortable doing uncomfortably difficult repairs. When this project wasn't infuriating, it was a lot of fun. So I guess this project was kind of a complete success, even though the repair was a total failure. And maybe the DSi is gonna come back as a zombie. This wasn't supposed to be a Halloween video, but it found its way into October, so yeah. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. Maybe you know what went wrong with the repair. Either way, I'm really excited to do more electronics projects like this in the future. Let me know if you'd like to see that on the channel. Anyways, I appreciate you watching. Thanks.